Hey listeners, be sure to check out slipdisc.com for the latest inside information on classical music now. Before we start today's episode, I want to share some super exciting news. We're hosting a live taping of Speaking Soundly, and you're invited. Mark your calendars now for Wednesday, April 24th at 7:30 p.m. in New York City at Lincoln Center's David Rubenstein Atrium. I'll be sitting down with the amazing Grammy Award-winning mezzo-soprano Joyce DiDonato. We'll discuss her early beginnings, her life as a singer, the creative process, and some of her more recent projects, including her return to the Met Opera stage this spring in the Hours. And best of all, it's free. That's right. No tickets are needed. Just show up. Again, don't miss our live taping of Speaking Soundly as part of Lincoln Center's Hear It Here podcast series on April 24th at 7:30 p.m. in New York City. For more information, check out lincolncenter.org/presents and be sure to follow us on Instagram at SpeakingSNDLY. I'll see you there. Grammy-nominated Welsh cellist and conductor Paul Watkins has enjoyed an illustrious and unparalleled musical career. Whether performing as principal cellist, chamber musician, or music director, his talent for collaboration is strong, a trait that proved invaluable during his audition for the world-renowned Emerson String Quartet.
We'd played a few movements of different pieces, and they seemed pretty happy. And I was like, well, what do you think? And they all smiled. And Gene Drucker went to his kitchen and he came back with a bottle of champagne.
You're listening to Speaking Soundly, a backstage pass to today's biggest stars of the music world. I'm your host, David Krause, principal trumpet of the Metropolitan Opera. During each episode, you'll hear me speak with inspiring performers about their creative process and the personal journey that led them to the stage. I can only think of a handful of musicians that have had as multifaceted a career as you've had. You're a cellist first and foremost, but you're a conductor. You're a chamber musician, but you've also held prominent positions in orchestras, both as cellist and as music director. And you continue to play chamber music all over the world, and you teach at Yale. But the thing about you that really sticks out to me is you never thought you'd achieve any success in music. How does someone doubtful of their own abilities achieve so much at such a high level?
That's a great question. I think I didn't come from a family of professional musicians, but I came from a deeply musical family. My mother she was a professional musician. She was a high school music teacher, so there was a great appreciation for music, but not for the business, not for the trade as you and I know it, that there hadn't really been any professional performing musicians in the family before. So I saw classical musicians when I was growing up as these untouchable figures on shiny LP covers. It was all terribly grand and seemed quite unattainable when I was a kid. So I think I maybe had an inkling by the time I was 18 that I might be able to have a go at the profession. But you're absolutely right. I thought it was just like an amazing hobby and a kind of love, and it was all terribly glamorous and just slightly out of reach.
It sounds like you grew up in a really musical environment. I assume your parents played instruments. What did they play?
Well, my parents had both been recipients of wonderful state music education as kids. My dad learned the viola and the violin. My mother was from the Welsh chapel tradition, playing the organ and singing, of course. So they had this great love of music, and they also had the opportunity to learn instruments. And I think they just carried that into their spare time. So my dad would read chamber music with his friends. Although my dad was a full-time school teacher, he could read Mozart, Beethoven string quartets on the weekend. So he did this with his friends, and it involved wine and, nice meals and all that kind of thing. And I loved all of that. So I used to sit in and listen. There was a piano in the home, and I started banging away at that when I was 3 or 4, and music was just a natural thing,
Mm-hmm. And what about the introduction of the cello?
That came through one of my dad's friends, a wonderful man called Stephen David, who was the local county cello teacher. Although, when I was a kid, I didn't know that. I didn't know what he did. I just knew that he was he was probably the coolest of my dad's friends. He had a leather jacket and he had tinted shades and a moustache, and he smoked all the time. And I always thought he could have been a walk-on character in Starsky and Hutch, something like that. He had that sort of
painting a vivid image.
Yeah, he was just a very cool dude. He could hold a cigarette in the last two fingers of his bow arm while bowing, actually with the most beautiful, relaxed action. So I thought, this is cool.
That's very slick.
The one thing, I never became a smoker, thank God.
You've had such early success winning competitions on cello. So I'm assuming that your progression on the cello at a young age was somewhat prodigious. Is that a fair assumption to make?
I started on the piano first, and for a while the piano was at about the same level as the cello, I would say, up until I was about 13 or 14. And I think the piano that's like the little virus that turned into the full-blown disease of becoming a conductor. Because I sort of got...
You said that, I didn't.
Yeah, I know. I thought you'd appreciate that. It was really, when I got to about 13 or 14, that I think I realized that my heart was a little bit more with the cello. So that's when the cello really started taking over. But I always kept the piano up, and I still like to play the piano from time to time.
So at this point, you're driven, you're enjoying music, it's the center of your life, yet you feel like it's not something that you're going to end up doing professionally. And at the age of 13, you go to the Yehudi Menuhin School, which is a small boarding school for exceptional young musicians. And you said it was there that your life changed and there was a shift in your focus. What was that change?
You're absolutely right. I think the main change about going to the Menuhin School was that instead of just the like-minded people, musically speaking, I was surrounded with were all adults in Wales, and they were making music for fun on the weekends and in the vacations. But I was now surrounded by people of my own age who were making music every day and, were available to play and read through things and talk about music. And just, music was in the air from the moment you got up to the moment you went to bed. And I think that it was that immersion that really changed me.
Yeah. Well, through school at 18, you'd win the BBC Young Musician of the Year award. It's a major prize.
That's right. And I have to stress the horn player, David Pyatt, he actually won the whole thing. I won the string class, so I got to the final. But it was in those days, it was on sort of primetime TV, and it was a big deal just to be in the final. So I won the string class.
It sounds like a big deal. You see, just knowing that you're a conductor and hearing you be so humble is really throwing me off. So,
oh, sorry. I'll tell you, I'm not much of an opera conductor, so maybe that's a different breed. But,
you're all the same to me. Anyway, yeah. Regardless, you still won a major prize, and at that point, you end up at Cambridge University, but you made a decision to drop out and do something else.
You are right. God, you've done your research. Oh, bloody hell! You're quite right. It is typical of me, and I'm aware of the periods in my life where they sort of peak, and then when I drop off with interest and I wanted to do something else. So part of the reason was that there was a sort of more than a whiff of amateurism about the way it was done there, because Cambridge, it doesn't have a facility for professionally training performing musicians. So compared to the Menuhin School, which had all been done at a pretty high level, it felt like a bit of a disappointment. So I was quite disillusioned with the whole thing, and I had to write enormous long essays and learn how to harmonize Palestrina and all that kind of thing. And that was all a bit much, really. I felt that I needed to be practicing the cello. I think that's when I truly felt the cello calling, when I was between the age of 18 and 19.
When you strayed away from it.
Exactly that. That. It goes, and then I really missed it. I knew what I missed. I missed all my Menuhin School friends, all the atmosphere of making music in London. I really missed it, and I needed to go back. This
sudden shift back to the cello was fairly seamless in that You won a principal cello position in the BBC Orchestra when you were just, 20 years old?
20, yeah, that's right, yeah.
What was it like leading a section of players in an established, great orchestra with absolutely no professional experience whatsoever?
It was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. But, I mean, that's the part of me that's not humble, that I think I'd always known since I was a young lad, that because I was good at playing the cello and the piano, good at doing music, I also love to perform. And there's an element of showing off when you perform, isn't there? So actually, I was in the youth orchestras in Wales. I was not happy to be sitting at the back. I wanted to be sitting at the front. I thought, right, I can do this. Let me show you what I can do. So in a way, yes, of course, it was terrifying to start off with because I didn't know the ropes and the speed at which the orchestra rehearsed and learned things. And, it was really, really a very sharp learning curve. But at the same time, I was pretty excited to be sitting there. I thought this is actually bloody great. I'm really enjoying this.
So you're in your 20s. You have this great job. You're supporting yourself very well.
Oh, that was pretty nice. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yet again, you decide to leave. What inspired you to make another leap of faith with your own career?
It was actually a natural progression. It was like a sort of build-up of pressure that after a few years in that job, the BBC started inviting me to play concertos with the orchestra, as is natural for any orchestra that has principal players who are interested in doing that. But again, because it was the BBC Symphony Orchestra, they were quite exposed dates, like I played the Elgar Concerto at the proms and, things were on TV and I started to get noticed as someone who was able to do that. So all of those kind of extra dates around my job, they just gained in number and in momentum. And it got to the point where the manager of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, during my last year or so, was, a little concerned that I was not turning up for things, and in the end she said, and she said very generously, and I'll never forget this was really great bit of management. She called me in for a chat and said, I think you should leave, but not in the sort of you're fired way, but, it's obvious that things are going to develop for you as a soloist and chamber musician. And my personal advice to you would be go for it. You've had a good 7 years or 8 years or whatever it was here. Give it a try. So this is a little actually key to what you were asking me earlier, David, was that, there have been moments in my life when people that I've respected have said to me, you can make it as a musician. And this was another moment where the manager said, you should go now. It's time to do the next thing. So I needed a little push.
I'm always curious to speak with instrumentalists who also conduct, because there are not many of them. To me, it's like talking with someone who died on the table and was resuscitated, and you're like, what was it like? What did you see? So
yeah.
So I want to ask you, what is it like to wield a baton, trying to get an orchestra of musicians to play the version of music that's in your head?
Oh, it's many different things, but it's exhilarating. It's mainly exhilarating, even if it's terrifying, and even if you don't get the kind of personality connection that every conductor hopes for, and also some orchestral musicians hope for. It's still exhilarating. It can be equally exhilarating to conduct an orchestra that is slightly resentful of you for whatever reason. Because in the end, we all still have to go on stage and play the piece. But I think it's more than that. For me, it's about making sounds happen that I can't make on the piano or the cello. So that I think what it is, I tell you what it is. It's an old friend of mine. He said, you know what you can do, Paul? You can make music go. You can make it go. You can start it and you can make it go somewhere. And in the end, that's a sort of basic thing about it. There's a lot of stuff to do, but in the end, you're moving this very, very big thing. And that's really, really exciting.
Now, this may be an unfair question, and it'll be the last about conducting, I promise. What's more challenging, playing an instrument or conducting?
I think the
you don't have to answer.
The gut answer to that is playing an instrument. It's more exposed. It is more exposing. That a gesture is a general thing. You know, people like Boulez and certain conductors who pride themselves on amazing technique might argue with me about that. But I would argue back that no matter how minute and beautiful your hand gestures are and how specific they are, it's not the same as producing a note, as producing a tone, and sometimes as producing a tone when you don't feel great or the chips are down or you haven't had enough time to practice or you're nervous. You know, so you can get it. It's a more generalist approach. So in that sense, I think technically playing an instrument is more challenging all the time. However, what's more challenging about being a good I'm talking about being a good conductor now, is that if you don't really know, like I was saying, where you want that music to go at every second, you're going to get found out, and not just found out in a sort of embarrassing, you've been exposed way, but you're going to feel it yourself. You're going to there's nothing worse than a sort of horrible pit in your stomach, and you're conducting a passage that you haven't really come to grips with, and you think, oh, it is like losing control of something on the ice. So that's a challenge too. That is definitely a challenge.
It's a great answer, but I'm going to edit everything out after you've said that playing an instrument is more challenging than conducting. All right. I want to fast forward to 2012. You get an invitation to audition for the Emerson String Quartet, the most famous string quartet in the world. And your first inclination is to politely decline.
Yes, it is.
So take me there. What's going through your head?
You know, all that stuff that we've discussed so far in this interview about me having certain insecurities about not coming from a family of professional musicians and chopping and changing my career path a little bit. I think by the time the Emerson Quartet called, I'd kind of gotten over all of that. And I was pretty damn happy with where I was, actually. Really a very fulfilling musical life in London. The Nash Ensemble, which is still the longest commitment I've had as a professional cellist, 16 years I was in that group, remains one of the musical highlights of my life. I was pretty happy. And then they told me how much money they make. So no,
yes, please.
It was. So I thought, okay, right. Well, no, it wasn't that. But my wife was actually really instrumental in just gently twisting my, again, like the manager of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, like my music teacher in the music school, just pushing me a little bit towards the right fork rather than the left fork or whatever. And she said, well, you've got to go and play with them. You can't just sit here in London and go, well, that's fine, but I'm perfectly happy. Don't diss them. Go. And as soon as she said that, as is often the case with me, I can get turned on a dime into some idea. I thought, right, okay, I will. So I was on a plane within about a week out to New York, and then that's how that all unfolded.
Auditioning for the Emerson String Quartet, it must have felt like, okay, Ringo retired. We'd like you to sit down at his drum set and sound like Ringo in the Beatles. I mean, first of all, what was the process like? You fly to the States, and then what happened? Fly to
the States, we did it sort of in top secret. Let's get one thing clear for the podcast, David. I was auditioning them, right? Yeah. It's a mutual thing. So, no, I don't want to be arrogant about it, but we were looking at each other, and also I never felt that pressure too explicitly. I put that pressure on myself a little bit by listening to their recordings because, they have this amazing recorded legacy. But I thought, no, the only way I can do this is by going in, being myself, and see what happens. And it seemed to work, luckily.
Was it a natural fit?
I think it was love at first love at first note, really, that it didn't seem to take much longer than 10 or 20 minutes before, we'd played a few movements of different pieces, different styles. And I thought, this really does feel great. It really did feel amazing. I suppose maybe it was like going and playing the drums in the Beatles, in that the other three, they were off. They were doing their thing. And it was up to me to kind of be there for that ride. And then there was a moment where we stopped between movements or pieces when they seemed pretty happy. And I was like, well, what do you think? And they all smiled. And they said, what do you think? And I said, well, shall we do this? And Gene Drucker went to his kitchen and he came back with a bottle of champagne. And that was that. So not much was said. And I think that was the right way to do it. If we'd had to discuss it too much, it would have been the wrong thing.
Yeah. When you're playing chamber music and the group is operating on a level that is just firing on all cylinders, and there's no communication verbally, but there's an intense communication musically, is there anything in life that can parallel that kind of communication?
Yes, there is, but this might be a family podcast.
Okay.
It should be like a love affair. I think that kind of intense meshing of your wavelengths, you have to be very open. You can't be closed up to other people. So it is almost like you have to fall in love with them. So I think it probably that's the closest thing. It's really like a romance.
You've had such a varied career. Where do you feel most at home as a musician?
That's a great question. And it's a difficult one to answer because if I feel very much at home behind a cello. And I was thinking this just yesterday, actually. I was sitting in my studio teaching at Yale, and most of the time I try to teach without the instrument. I try and describe and get the students to play with their own sound. But now and again, they'll ask me, well, how do you do this? And I'll go to the cello and I'll go, oh, I guess that's how I do it. And I just felt sitting there with the cello, I felt incredibly at home. It really did feel like part of me. So I think, yes, sitting behind a cello. But I actually, when I sit behind a piano keyboard, I feel pretty much at home too. And nowadays, although this was not the case when I started, I am pretty much at home when I step up onto a podium and look at an orchestra. So, just making music, just doing music.
You're a cello professor at Yale, where they have a studio of really talented cellists who are dying to have a fraction of the success that you've had. What do you say to these students to encourage them when you yourself at their age never thought that you would attain any of this?
Oh, yeah, I think I say to them that they've got to take every opportunity that comes to them, even if it doesn't seem like an opportunity, or even if it's not quite their ideal thing. To be perfectly frank, playing in a symphony orchestra was not my ideal thing. But if I hadn't gone in that way, a whole host of opportunities would have been closed off to me, or they would have happened at a much later stage. So I say to them, whatever you do, even if it's just going off to play a small gig at your local church or temple or something like that, you should go and do it as if it's the most important thing. Go into everything you do with enthusiasm and joy and love, and things will work out.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Speaking Soundly. If you like what you heard, please tell your friends about it. Spread the word. Be sure to follow, rate us, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. To keep up on future episodes, follow us on Instagram at SpeakingSNDLY and visit our website, artfulnarrativesmedia.com. Tune in next week as we hear another inspiring artist speaking soundly.